A sharp, metallic thud from the first-class door split the air in half, freezing all 32 passengers as they turned at once. A black attorney, in a sleek grey suit, sat motionless, eyes wide, unable to believe what was happening to him. Then, the announcement from the intercom crashed through the cabin like a blow to everyone's pride. Ladies and gentlemen, this flight is delayed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. Champagne glasses halted mid-air, breaths caught in throats. But the most stunned of all was Elias Turner, 39 years old senior partner at Hamilton & Price, one of the most prestigious law firms in Denver. He had no idea that in 10 minutes his life would cross a line. No courtroom, no presentation, and no Harvard degree had ever trained him for. 30 minutes earlier, Denver International Airport was running on its usual rhythm suitcase wheels, rolling across polished tile boarding calls, echoing through steel pillars that rose like the ribcage of a futuristic city. Elias moved through the crowd like a clean cut through fabric, tall, composed eyes, sharp and alert. But behind that immaculate exterior was an exhaustion he had been dragging for weeks. Today, he was not simply boarding a flight. He was flying to New York to defend Williams Quantum Labs, a tech company founded by black scientists, now on the verge of being swallowed by a massive corporation through a dirty takeover scheme. This lawsuit was not just a legal battle. It was a fight for equity. And Elias knew that back home every eye was on him. The pressure felt like an invisible hand pressing into his shoulders for the past 3 weeks, pulling him through sleepless nights in his office, the cold neon lights washing over a tired but determined face. He had grown up in a modest Denver neighborhood where dreams were often strangled before they had a chance to breathe, but he had climbed out, reached the top of the legal world, and pulled others up behind him. Everything today was going according to plan. Or at least Elias believed so. 7:48 in the morning. The final boarding call echoed from a cafe near Gate Bravo, 36, just as he passed by. Elias sighed softly and quickened his steps. At the check-in point, he handed over his ticket. The agent, a young woman about 26 with gentle curls, paused for a second. "Sir, first class is boarding through the other line. Are you sure this is your ticket?" Her tone was not rude, but the small crease of doubt on her forehead stung with a familiarity he wished he could forget. A kind of suspicion he had faced hundreds of times in his life. He offered the polite smile he had perfected over the years. "Yes." "Seat 3, Alpha." She double-checked the ticket as if waiting for it to change, then forced a thin smile. "Of course, Mr. Turner. Enjoy your flight." He nodded and moved on, leaving behind a heaviness he refused to acknowledge aloud. 1,000,000 times before, and it still hurt like the first. When Elias stepped onto the plane, the scent of premium leather, the sound of seat latches clicking, and the warm golden lights of the first-class cabin unfolded like an alternate universe, the kind he had worked his entire life to earn a place in. Flight attendant Kara Jensen, 33 years old, offered a soft, professional smile. "Welcome aboard, sir. First class is to your left." Her smile was different from the gate agent's. No suspicion, no hesitation. Just professionalism. Elias felt a brief flutter of relief. He stowed his briefcase, sank into seat 3. Alpha, the perfect spot for a few hours of rest. The seat embraced him, the engine hummed steadily, and for a fleeting moment, the heavy world of litigation faded away. As Kara brought him a glass of sparkling water, Elias leaned back, exhaled and closed his eyes. It would be the last peaceful moment of his entire flight. The thudding rhythm of polished leather shoes marched through the cabin like the drums of an approaching storm. Richard Alden, 56 years old, CEO of Alden Manufacturing, one of the most powerful industrial empires in the country, entered first class with the swagger of a man who believed he owned airspace itself. His massive frame, commanding aura, and perfectly tailored navy suit screamed influence and arrogance. Behind him, his assistant trembled under the weight of a heavy portfolio and a rolling suitcase. Richard's eyes swept the cabin, and when he saw seat 3, Alpha already occupied, his expression curdled instantly. A muttered curse slipped from his lips. It had begun. Bradley Moore, the lead flight attendant, rushed forward as if summoned by a whistle. "Mr. Alden, we were not expecting you on this flight." Richard cut him off, voice like a blade. "I need seat 3 Alpha. Now." Kara stood a few steps away, her face, tightening her eyes, darting to Elias. She knew exactly what was coming, and her stomach knotted with dread. Bradley pulled Richard aside in a clumsy attempt at subtlety. "3 Alpha is taken, sir. We will handle it. Just give me a moment." But their repeated glances toward Elias were anything but discreet. Everyone saw. Elias saw. And in that moment, he felt something he thought he had grown past. The sting of being diminished, even in the very space he had spent 20 years proving he belonged to. Kara approached slowly, hesitantly, apology already written in her eyes before she spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Turner, we are having a small seating issue. We were wondering if you might be willing to move to economy." Elias opened his eyes, and for a split second, surprise flickered, before settling into a calm, controlled smile. "Is there a technical issue with the plane?" "No, sir. Has every passenger been asked to move?" Kara swallowed. "No." Her answer was gentle as a breath, yet heavy as a verdict. Richard stepped forward, making no effort to hide the disdain in his voice. "Look, this is simple. I need that seat. You will be more comfortable with your own people in the back, anyway." His words dropped into first class like a stone shattering a still lake. Silence froze. Some passengers lowered their eyes. Others peeked at Elias with quiet guilt. No one spoke. Elias met Richard's gaze, the smile gone. "I purchased this seat. I intend to stay in it." A simple statement, but in that moment it struck like a ricochet from a lifetime of being underestimated. Bradley forced himself between them, tension knotting his voice. "Sir, please do not make this difficult." Elias braced one hand on the armrest and turned slightly, his voice soft, but razor-sharp. "I am not making anything difficult. I am simply keeping what I paid for." Angela, a middle-aged woman in seat 2. Delta clutched her scarf, eyes anxious. She had never seen anyone stand up to Richard Alden. No one dared. Stories about his temper spread across industries, ruthless, explosive, and notorious for ruining careers based on whim. But the man in seat 3 Alpha did not blink. Captain Reynolds heard the commotion and stepped out. His eyes moved from Richard, a frequent VIP, to Elias. And in a fraction of a second, something shifted. Judgment, bias, decision. Then he delivered the sentence everyone feared. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will call airport security." The air compressed. Kara's heartbeat spiked. Bradley's eyes gleamed as if he finally had the excuse he wanted. Elias closed his eyes for one heartbeat, then inhaled slowly, deeply, as if arriving at a decision forged across a lifetime. Then called them. 3 words, enough to rewrite the future of the entire airline. Kara felt a chill crawl down her spine. Elias's tone did not belong to a panicked passenger, not to someone intimidated by rank or titles. It belonged to someone who held a different kind of authority, something Richard Bradley and even the captain had failed to recognize. Real power. Not the power of wealth, not the power of corporate hierarchy, the power of knowledge, the power of the law, the power of a man who had confronted prejudice his whole life and won. As the captain stepped back into the cockpit to call security, Elias pulled out his phone. His hand did not tremble. His voice did not crack. He simply dialed. Jonathan Elias said, "I am in seat 3, Alpha on Atlantic skies, flight 217. They are trying to remove me because another passenger wants my seat." Jonathan paused for 1 second. Then his voice sliced through the speaker like steel. "Put me on speaker." Elias tapped the button, and the cabin fell silent. Jonathan Pryce was no ordinary man. He was the most influential attorney in the Rockies, the same man who once forced a major oil conglomerate into a settlement worth $200 million, the kind of lawyer who never bowed to anyone. His voice thundered through the phone. "This airline has 4 board members who are my clients, and Elias Turner is being unlawfully singled out." The atmosphere shifted instantly, as if someone had torn through an illusion. Richard Alden froze mid-step. Bradley's eyes widened. Kara covered her mouth. Several passengers looked up in stunned surprise. Elias was not an ordinary man. He was someone the entire system should fear. And this right here was the moment everything flipped. Not through shouting, not through force, not through ego, but through truth. Through the real power hidden behind an unassuming exterior, the power Elias had spent his entire life earning. And this flight had just become the first battleground of a storm that would shake an entire industry. The air inside the first-class cabin grew so thick it felt almost visible, while Jonathan Pryce's words continued to ring like metal striking steel. "This man is being unlawfully singled out." A few passengers leaned forward ever so slightly, as if trying to memorize every syllable of what felt like a historic moment. The silence held for exactly 3 seconds before the intercom crackled to life with an announcement that airport security was on their way to the aircraft. But the most shocking part was not that officers were coming. It was Elias's reaction. He smiled soft and calm, a serenity so clear it sent a shiver through the room. Kara, who had been standing there since the beginning, felt a cold spike race down her spine. In that moment, she remembered the day she had been dismissed by a passenger because of her hastily tied blonde hair and her too gentle voice. She had swallowed it. She had stayed silent. But Elias was standing up for something she had never dared to demand for her self-respect. Bradley, who had pushed her into approaching Elias earlier, was in an entirely different state. His face tightened like a rope about to snap. He tried to hold his voice steady. "Sir, please remain calm until security arrives." Elias lifted his gaze expression, simple, not defiant, yet not yielding. "I have been calm from the start." Bradley's fingers curled slightly as his breath caught. For a brief second, he felt something close to fear. Not because Elias was loud or aggressive, but because he was not nervous. He was not frantic. He was not scrambling to explain himself. Truly powerful people sat still in the heart of the storm. At the back of the cabin, Richard Alden, a man accustomed to commanding entire industries, looked so irritated that the veins on his neck stood out. He snapped toward his assistant. "Call Douglas." Now. The assistant fumbled with his phone, hands trembling. It was not weakness only that he had never seen Richard unravel like this. Richard turned back to Elias, his voice cracking under the weight of his own arrogance. "I know how this works. People like you do not win. You do not belong in this section." A sentence sharpened by the contempt he had carried for years. Elias tilted his head, studying him, the way someone might study a wounded, cornered animal. "People like me," he repeated, yet without anger, only curiosity. Richard never realized that this calmness was the sharpest blade in the room. Then a younger voice rose from seat 1. Charlie. "Sir, he did not do anything wrong. It was a college student, about 21 backpack, covered in university stickers." He looked at Elias, then at Richard. "Why is no one else asked to move? Why only him?" Someone inhaled sharply. Then, like dominoes falling, a few passengers began whispering, questioning, shifting in their seats. The air changed. Fear had morphed into quiet outrage. The cockpit door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out with the expression of a man preparing to deliver a final verdict. "So," he said to Elias, "security will escort you off the plane if you continue refusing." Elias straightened in his seat. Half a second later he spoke. "Escort me for what reason exactly?" The captain's eyebrows flicked upward, but Elias did not stop. "I have followed all boarding procedures. I have caused no disturbance. I am seated with my belt fastened. And I have paid for this seat." He turned to the entire cabin. "If someone else here, any one of you, was asked to give up your paid seat without cause, would you move?" The question pierced every heart in the room like an arrow. No one answered, but the silence itself was an answer. Moments later, footsteps echoed from business class. Airport security had arrived. 2 officers stepped forward. The one leading them was Officer Daniel Hayes, 50 years old, a face shaped by years of experience, and eyes that had witnessed enough injustice to no longer be fooled by appearances. He stopped before the 3 men, Elias, Bradley, and Richard. "All right," Daniel said, "someone explain to me what is going on." Richard lunged at the chance like a fox spotting prey. "This man will explain for himself," Daniel cut him off. It was the first time all year anyone had dared interrupt Richard. Elias explained concisely, complete and calm, without a hint of dramatization. He stated that he had been asked to vacate his seat, despite no rule violation, that there was no technical issue, that no other passenger had been asked, and that everything began only after a so-called VIP demanded seat 3 Alpha. Daniel turned to Kara, who had been silent, but whose eyes kept pleading for the chance to tell the truth. "Is that accurate, ma'am?" Daniel asked. Kara took a breath. 1, 2. She nodded. "Yes, that is correct." Bradley spun toward her, eyes wide. Karen Kara cut him off, her voice cold enough to stop him mid-sentence. "My name is Kara." For the first time in 4 years of working with Bradley, she stood up to him, and her truth shattered every excuse Richard Alden had left. At that moment, Elias's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Jonathan Price calling. He answered. Jonathan spoke quickly. "Elias, I just spoke with 2 of the airline's board members. They are watching the situation right now, and they are furious." Elias switched to speaker. The entire cabin went silent. Jonathan's voice returned firmer than before. "Officers, be advised that removing my partner without legitimate cause will be considered a direct violation of federal regulations, and legal consequences will be immediate." Daniel straightened. He looked at Elias, then at Richard. And he understood. This was no ordinary passenger. This was a man backed by an entire structure of power. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. For years he had been surrounded by "Yes, sir. Right away, sir. We will handle it immediately." But today, for the first time, someone threw the truth back into his face. His authority was no longer the biggest in the room. Not anymore. Sir Daniel turned to Captain Reynolds. "Unless this passenger has violated Federal Aviation rules, we do not have grounds to remove him." The captain opened his mouth, but found no defense. Passengers were still recording, and Daniel understood that better than anyone. Additionally, he continued, "We will need all names and written documentation of who initiated the seat removal request." Bradley went pale. Richard went red. The captain turned purple. Only Elias smiled faintly. From the back of the cabin, a middle-aged man spoke up, steady and firm. "He is right." Heads turned. It was Terence Hall, 45, a high school history teacher with a gentle face and eyes that burned like wildfire. For years, Terence said, "I have watched people like him, like me, treated differently on flights. Random checks, assumptions, questions we should not have to answer. I am glad someone is finally standing up." A woman nodded. A man raised his hand in agreement. Several phones lifted to record. No one stood with Richard anymore. Not a single person. Richard's breath grew heavy. He turned to his assistant. "Tell them to shut those phones off." "Sir, I do not think that is how it works anymore." The sentence landed like a blade, piercing the last shield of Richard's pride. As the cabin swelled with murmurs, another figure quietly stepped into her role. Lena Brooks, 28, an influencer with 3 million followers. She was live streaming. "Everyone, you are seeing this live. A first-class passenger is being pushed out of his paid seat because a CEO wants it. This is discrimination happening in real time. Tens of thousands watched, then hundreds of thousands. The hashtag #FirstClass." While black ignited like gasoline meeting flame, Elias heard the constant chime of comments on Lena's stream, but he didn't waver. Finally, he spoke one sentence, a sentence that sent the online world into a spiral. Justice begins when someone refuses to move. Minutes later, the airline posted a statement on Twitter. "We are investigating reports of an incident on Flight 217 involving passenger treatment." 10 minutes after that, the post was deleted because leadership had just realized this incident could not be contained by a generic apology. As the cabin descended into organized chaos, Kara approached Elias, her voice soft, hesitant, but sincere. "Mr. Turner, I am sorry. I should have refused. I knew it was wrong." Elias looked at her, his gaze a gentle touch on her trembling heart. "It is hard to stand up to people who control your paycheck." Kara lowered her head, eyes glistening. It was the first moment that day when Elias felt something important. He was not alone. The intercom clicked on. Captain Reynolds delivered an announcement that stunned every passenger. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, this flight is delayed indefinitely." A wave of groans, shuffling seats, complaints, but this time not a single glare fell on Elias. Every eye turned to Richard Alden. The most powerful executive in the cabin was now just a man pressed against the aircraft wall, holding a trembling phone as he received news the board of Alden Manufacturing was in emergency session. In seat 3, Alpha Elias set his phone down and drew a long breath. Not from exhaustion, but to steady himself against the rising truth. The storm was coming, and this time The Storm stood with Elias Turner. Denver Airport felt as if someone had pressed a giant pause button. News spread through the terminal like a wildfire catching wind. From the waiting area near Gate Bravo, 36 passengers murmured to one another, their eyes drawn towards the glass wall where the Atlantic Skies aircraft sat frozen in place. But inside the cabin was where the true storm raged. A heavy silence blanketed first class, an eerie stillness, like the flat surface of a lake, seconds before a violent storm breaks. And beneath that silence, unseen currents were already shifting. Elias Turner remained seated in 3 Alpha, his face composed, as if the chaos swirling outside could not touch him at all. But deep in his eyes, a new light flickered, the light of a man who refused to be stepped on by the same prejudice that had shadowed him his entire life. Kara stood nearby, fighting to steady her breathing. She had never seen a passenger this calm. Calm in a way that was unsettling. Calm in a way that shrank the authority Bradley and Richard once believed they owned. That was when Bradley turned toward her, voice low and threatening. Saying that in front of passengers is career suicide, Kara. Her heart tightened, but for the first time in years, fear did not overwhelm her. She replied softly, with a sharpness that cut through the air like a needle. You are the one committing career suicide, Bradley. One sentence. And Bradley had no answer. At the rear of the cabin, Richard Alden held his phone to his ear, pacing like a wounded animal. I told you. I want Douglas now. I do not care if he is in a meeting. A pause. Then Richard's breathing hitched. What the board is meeting without me. No, listen. This is a misunderstanding. His voice cracked, strangled by panic. His young assistant tried to maintain composure, but sweat glistened along his temple. No one in the cabin spoke, but everyone sensed the same truth. An empire was shaking. Right here, right now. Lena Brooks, the influencer, seated in 2. Charlie continued live streaming. She whispered into her camera, her voice crisp and clear. Guys, this is unreal. He is losing control. His board is literally calling without him. 12,000 viewers, then 18,000, then 25,000. Within minutes, her live stream became a snowball, racing downhill, gathering hundreds of thousands of viewers. A pinned comment appeared on the stream. This is bigger than a seat. This is systemic. Elias caught sight of the words on Lena's screen. He nodded once. Very slightly, but enough for Lena to tighten her grip on the phone, knowing she had just captured a moment that mattered. With the security team standing by Officer Daniel Hayes, the man whose eyes revealed more wisdom than his words turned toward Elias, then surveyed the entire cabin. Mr. Turner, is there anything else you need? Recorded for accuracy, the entire cabin held its breath. Elias leaned back, letting his gaze travel slowly across the room. He saw fear in the eyes of every black passenger. He saw guilt in the eyes of several white passengers. He saw restrained anger in the clenched fists of Terence Hall. He saw Kara's rigid shoulders. He saw Bradley's helplessness. He saw Richard's collapsing ego. Then he spoke. Yes. I would like to state for the record that this request for removal was made solely after Mr. Alden demanded my seat. No safety concerns were mentioned. Noted, Daniel replied. Richard erupted, his voice shrill. Are you kidding me? I have seniority. I have flown this airline for 20 years. I always get that seat. Elias turned his head. His eyes held no anger. Only truth. 20 years of flying does not make you the owner of seat 3, Alpha. Richard choked on his reply. The sound of him swallowing echoed through the cabin. A quiet ping sounded from Elias's pocket. A message from Jonathan Price board members are watching the live stream. The CEO is flying back from Chicago right now. Elias raised his eyebrows. A subtle, unreadable smile appeared. Not the smile of a man who had won. The smile of a man who had just seen the entire chessboard. He typed back, "Good." Let them see everything. Suddenly the aircraft door opened. A flood of white light poured into the cabin. A woman stepped inside, tall, straight-shouldered, wearing a light grey suit, her dark hair tied neatly behind her head. Her entrance made the entire cabin hold its breath for 3 seconds. She wore no name tag. She did not need one. Every staff member recognized her instantly. Patricia Monroe, regional manager of Atlantic Skies Airlines. And unlike Bradley, unlike Captain Reynolds, unlike the people who bent to power, Patricia arrived with the aura of someone sent to stop a fire, not protect the ones who started it. She swept her gaze across the cabin, missing nothing. Then her eyes settled on Elias Turner. She exhaled softly. "Mr. Turner," she said, "I assume you are Elias." "Correct. I would like to speak with you privately." "No." Elias cut her off instantly. The cabin flinched. Even Patricia paused. Elias continued, his voice still gentle, but the kind of gentle that made the air tremble. "Transparency serves everyone best. We stay here." Patricia studied him for a few seconds. She understood, and she nodded. "Very well." She turned to Richard. "Mr. Alden, we have a seat available in 5, Charlie." Richard glared. "I do not sit in row 5. I sit in row 3, left side, always." "Then we can rebook you on the next flight." 1 sentence. But it struck like a slap across Richard's face. He stammered. You cannot speak to me like that." "I spend millions with this airline." Patricia met his eyes, unafraid, unmoved, unimpressed, and we value all customers equally. That sentence slammed a door shut directly in front of Richard. The first time in his life he encountered a world where money could not buy people. Kara watched, trembling. It was the first time in her career she saw a high-ranking manager stand with the truth instead of siding with power. Warmth swelled in her chest, a mixture of hope and release. Patricia turned back to Elias. "Mr. Turner, on behalf of Atlantic Skies, I sincerely apologize for what happened. You may remain in your assigned seat," Elias replied quietly. "I know. The cabin nearly exploded in silent shock. I know. Not arrogance, not challenge, but certainty." He knew he was right. And now the system was forced to admit it. But the real change had not arrived yet. Not with an apology. Not with a seat. Elias looked at Patricia, his gaze sharpened like metal forged in fire. "I will need written documentation of the incident. Why I was asked to move, who initiated the request, and who approved it." Patricia swallowed, not out of fear of Elias, but because she understood this would set the entire system ablaze once exposed. Richard burst out. "Over my dead body, you are writing anything down." No one looked at him anymore. He was no longer the center of the room. Elias was. Patricia drew a deep breath, and with a steady voice rarely heard from her, she said, "Mr. Turner, we will provide everything." Someone clapped, then another. Then the entire cabin applauded. Not for Elias, but for the truth finally being called by its name. Amid the applause, the buzz of the live stream, Richard's rasping breaths, and the constant click of recording phones, Elias straightened his back and tightened his hands. In that moment, he realized something. What was happening did not belong only to him. Not only to Seat 3 Alpha. Not only to a single flight. This was the moment when decades of repeating stories finally met someone who refused to let them continue. And Elias knew. This was only the beginning, because the biggest doors, the real reforms, the changes that shake entire industries, often begin with one person who dares to stand up at the exact moment no one else will. The aircraft door closed behind Patricia Monroe, and First Class sank into a silence, unlike before. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of a crowd trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. In front of them was no longer a passenger treated unfairly. In front of them was a man the entire system had been forced to bow to, and the way Elias Turner remained seated in 3 alpha straight-backed, quiet, composed, and made it feel as if everything they had seen so far was only the tip of the iceberg, because the real chaos was erupting outside the plane. In the waiting area near Gate Bravo, 3 6 passengers gathered in growing numbers. A cluster of students whispered into their phones as they recorded screens updating Lena's live stream, second by second. A middle-aged couple leaned in close, listening to faint echoes from the aircraft speakers. Even travelers preparing for unrelated flights stopped and exchanged looks, filled with curiosity and unease. The airport was enormous, but the news spread like an explosion. And moving through that chaos was a woman whose focused expression and decisive steps suggested she had just heard the call of battle. That woman was Amelia Turner, 40 years old, Elias's wife. But in this airport at this moment, no one saw her as the spouse of the man confronting the airline. No, she was the chief executive officer of Horizon Crisis Consulting, one of the top crisis management firms in the United States. She had not come because she was panicked. She had come to fight. Inside the cabin, the situation was shifting to a new level of tension. Patricia, though she had momentarily extinguished the flames, remained near the aircraft door, waiting for further instructions. And those instructions were about to come in a way she didn't want. Her phone vibrated sharply. On the screen, CEO Thomas Whitaker. Her heart tightened. No one wanted a call from the CEO in a situation like this, especially not from a CEO who had just been forced by his board of directors to rush back to headquarters because a viral video was now trending nationwide. Patricia stepped back and lifted the phone. Sir Patricia Whitaker said, his voice heavy as iron report. "We have temporarily stabilized the situation. The passenger is allowed to remain in his seat." And I saw the live stream. Patricia swallowed a cold wave. "Sir, I do not say anything. I will be there shortly." She returned to the cabin, forcing her face to remain calm. No one knew what had just happened, but the more perceptive ones, namely Elias, sensed the air pressure drop another degree. Richard Alden remained in the aisle, clutching his phone like it was the only thing preventing him from collapsing. "No, I did not threaten anyone. That seat is mine. They are overreacting. Douglas, you need to say something." "Hello." "Hello." He stared at his phone in disbelief. One look was enough for Elias to understand. His board had abandoned him. Meanwhile, Lena kept live streaming, but her voice had shifted to something lower, sharper, not the voice of an influencer, but of someone who understood the historical weight of the moment. Everyone, something bigger is happening. His wife just walked into the terminal. Amelia Turner. She is a crisis strategist. This might turn into a corporate earthquake. Thousands of comments erupted. No way she is here. A power couple. Iconic. This airline has no idea who they're dealing with. Richard is done. Elias heard the murmurs. He did not need to look at the camera to know Lena had aimed her lens at him. He turned his head slightly, not toward her, but toward Kara. She stood a few steps away, clutching her small notebook, eyes filled with guilt and worry. Elias gestured for her to come closer. Kara stiffened, then slowly walked toward him. He spoke softly. "Do not be afraid." Kara felt her throat tighten. No one had ever said those words to her when she made a mistake. No one had ever made her feel protected. Elias continued, "You did the right thing." And with those 4 words, Kara released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. On the other side of the cabin, Terence Hall watched and smiled faintly. He understood. This was no longer only Elias's story. This was the story of everyone who had ever been told to endure, who had been forced into silence out of fear of losing their job being misunderstood or being labeled the troublemaker. Terence whispered, not to anyone, just into the air, "This feels different." And then, as if signaling the start of a new chapter, the aircraft door opened again. 3 people stepped inside, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, wearing a sharp black suit, walking with the confidence of someone accustomed to facing television cameras, a woman around 30 carrying a laptop and documents, and a public relations staff member of the airline whose face had turned pale. No introduction was necessary. Everyone recognized him instantly. The CEO of Atlantic Skies, Thomas Whitaker. The entire first-class cabin felt as if the oxygen had been sucked out. Even Richard froze, mouth half open. Whitaker did not look at Richard. He did not look at Bradley. He did not look at the captain. He looked directly at one person, Elias Turner. He moved through the cabin like a bolt of winter lightning. No detours, no hesitation. When he stopped in front of seat 3, Alpha, no one dared to shift in their seat. Then he spoke. "Mr. Turner, I believe I owe you more than an apology." Elias did not stand. Not out of disrespect, but because he knew this was not the moment to bow. He answered quietly. "I believe so too." 2 men, one who had climbed to the top of corporate power, through experience, the other through intelligence and grit, now faced one another like opposing magnetic poles. Whitaker took a deep breath. "Before anything else," he said, "I want to clarify that we do not discriminate. At least we shouldn't." That last sentence tightened the cabin like a drawn bowstring, and just as Elias prepared to reply, the door opened yet again. This time, a voice rang out. "Then you will want to hear what I have to say." Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the bright white light from the corridor, hair dark and soft, cream suit, immaculate face, sharp and steady, was Amelia Turner. She entered the cabin like someone walking into a Fortune 100 crisis briefing. Kara instinctively stepped aside. Lena's hand trembled slightly as she continued live streaming. Elias saw Amelia, and his lips curved into the smallest smile, not a casual smile, but the smile of someone who knew the strongest reinforcement imaginable had arrived. Amelia walked straight to CEO Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice gentle but forceful enough to ripple through the air, "I am Amelia Turner. And before you offer an explanation, I believe we should establish the truth." Whitaker exhaled. "Mrs. Turner." Amelia lifted a hand, stopping him. Polite, but as sharp as a blade. "What happened to my husband," she said, was not a misunderstanding. Each word fell like a hammer. It was not a procedural error. It was not a communication mistake. It was not due to a lack of available seats. Then she delivered the sentence the entire cabin would never forget. It was discrimination, and it was carried out with full intent. Whittaker held his breath. The cabin held its breath. Richard Alden's knuckles whitened from gripping the armrest. Amelia met the CEO's eyes without blinking. And depending on how you handle this, she continued, the future of this airline will be determined right here. The sentence struck like lightning. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Elias watched Amelia, the woman who had stood beside him, through 14-hour court days, through nights when he fell asleep at his desk, through moments when he nearly gave up. Now she stood before the CEO of a major airline, saying the words he no longer needed to say himself. He was not fighting alone anymore. And that was power, real power. Richard tried to jump in. This is ridiculous. She has exaggerated. Amelia turned her gaze to him, her voice ice cold. I was not speaking to you. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, a woman said that to him in a way he could not respond to. CEO Whittaker looked at Amelia, then at Elias, then at the cabin. And unexpectedly there was something in his voice that no one anticipated. Fear. Not fear of losing his position, not fear of upsetting a VIP, but fear of losing the entire airline. Mrs. Turner, he said slowly, allow me a chance to make this right. Elias narrowed his eyes slightly. Amelia folded her arms. We will listen, she said. But nothing will be decided behind closed doors. Everything will happen in front of every passenger, especially those who witness the truth. Terence Hall nodded. Lena lifted her camera higher. Kara stood tall for the first time in her entire shift. Elias looked around the cabin at the ordinary people who had suddenly become witnesses. He understood. What he was about to do would no longer be for him. It would be for everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their skin color, forced out of their seat, told to comply so they would not cause trouble. CEO Whittaker drew a long breath. He knew he was standing at what corporations call a Level 5 crisis breaking point. One wrong sentence could send Atlantic skies into free fall. Mr. Turner, he said quietly, tell me what must we do? Elias leaned back in his seat, his eyes sharp as a blade, and he spoke the words that would ignite the largest reform movement in the aviation industry in a decade. We begin with the truth, and then accountability. The first-class cabin of flight. 217 no longer resembled an airplane. It resembled a courtroom, or more accurately, a battlefield where three forces stood in open confrontation. Elias Turner, the man underestimated, yet holding the true power. Amelia Turner, the strategist, sharp enough to make even a CEO tread carefully. And Thomas Whittaker, the man now standing on the fragile line between saving his airline or watching it burn under the weight of its own internal failures. Everyone held their breath. Even the engine hum from the left wing, usually steady like a heartbeat, seemed to slow. Whittaker clenched his hands, struggling to maintain composure under Amelia's cold, glass-like gaze. He understood one thing: this battle could not be resolved with the empty, polished apologies taught in corporate PR training sessions. No, this was the moment where strategy, accountability, and transparency had to appear. Because if they did not, Atlantic skies would fall, and Elias was the one holding the key. All right, Whittaker, finally said, turning to Elias in a steady voice, tell me what you need. Elias did not answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, studying the CEO's eyes, not to intimidate, but to assess. Elias had spent a lifetime reading opponents in courtrooms. One misplaced blink, one breath too fast, one unconscious tightening of a fist. With a single detail, he could tell whether someone was lying or playing a part. And what he saw in Whittaker now was not an act. It was real fear. Not fear of Elias, not fear of Richard Alden, but fear of the massive shadow called the Internet. Before Elias could respond, Richard suddenly shoved himself into the conversation, unable to endure another second of being ignored. This is outrageous. He thinks he can dictate? Amelia turned her head, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Sit down," Richard froze. His young assistant stared at the floor, cheeks red with second-hand embarrassment. In the past, anyone who spoke to Richard that way would be fired immediately. But Amelia was not his employee, and Richard felt something he had never truly felt, the loss of power. He sank into his seat like a man whose hands had just been bound. Whittaker turned to Amelia. "I understand your frustration. Mrs. Turner, frustration." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "You think I am frustrated?" Whittaker fell silent. Amelia leaned forward, slightly, resting one hand on the headrest of the seat in front of her. Her voice grew low and unshakably clear. "I have advised dozens of corporations through crises far worse than this. And let me make something very clear." The cabin went utterly still. This is not merely an incident. It is the symptom of a broken system, and that system is exposing itself to millions of people. Kara's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. Terence Hall nodded with solemn understanding. Lena raised her camera higher to capture every word. Amelia continued. "You do not need apologies. You need correction. And you need it now." Whittaker swallowed. For the first time, he did not argue back. He listened. Elias set his phone down on his lap and met the CEO's eyes. "Here is where we begin," he said. "Step 1, accountability." Whittaker nodded slightly. Elias continued, his voice steady and cold. "Everyone involved in this discriminatory request from the moment Mr. Alden stepped onto this plane must be identified." Bradley jolted upright, as if splashed with ice water. Captain Reynolds stiffened. Patricia Monroe glanced at them, both sadness flickering behind her eyes. She already knew there would be consequences. Elias continued. "Step 2. Documentation." He looked directly at Patricia. "I want a written report signed by you and the names of every staff member who made or approved the decision." Patricia exhaled deeply, but nodded. This was a time bomb. But she knew it had to be done. Then Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough for only the essential ears to hear. "Step 3. The cabin held its breath. We fixed the system, not just the symptom. That was the moment Whittaker understood something vital. Elias did not want compensation. He did not want a voucher. He did not want an upgrade. He did not want silence. Elias wanted reform, the most dangerous demand a corporation could face. Before Whittaker could respond, a shout erupted from the back of the cabin. "Oh my God, the video is on CNN," Lena spun around. A passenger held up their phone, the screen lit with a red headline. "Breaking news, first class. Passenger allegedly victim of racial bias on Flight 217. The cabin trembled with tension. Bradley turned pale. Captain Reynolds looked at the floor, face ashen. Richard Alden nearly collapsed. Lena whispered into her live stream. "Guys, this just became national. And this was only minute 37 since Richard stepped onto the plane." Whittaker turned back to Elias. His voice, lower, more sincere than at any point in his career. "Mr. Turner, tell me exactly what you want from Atlantic skies." Elias did not answer immediately. He scanned the cabin. He looked at Kara, who had nearly compromised her conscience to protect her job. He looked at Terence, who had endured countless suspicious stares at airports. He looked at the white passengers, wrestling with the uncomfortable truth that they had witnessed injustice their whole lives, but rarely spoken up. Elias exhaled softly. Then he said, "I want change that outlives this flight." The cabin felt the words ripple through it. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was a declaration. Before Elias could say more, someone stepped up beside Seat 3 Alpha. A hand rested gently on Elias's shoulder. Amelia. She said nothing, but Elias understood the message. It was time to shift from defense to offense. Elias stood, and the instant he stood, something in the room shifted. A stronger presence, a clearer authority. He was no longer the man told to give up his seat. He was the man leading the room. Mr. Whittaker Elias said, "Let me make this clear." He raised 3 fingers. 1 mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. Lena whispered, "Yes." 2 an independent oversight board for all discrimination complaints. Terence nodded firmly. 3 public quarterly reports on progress and violations. No hiding data. No vague statements. Patricia wrote every word, knowing history was unfolding. Elias lowered his hand. And finally, protections for employees who refuse to execute discriminatory requests. Kara lifted a hand to her mouth. A tear escaped her eye. Elias continued softly. Not every injustice begins with hatred. Some begin with fear. The cabin fell silent, absorbing every syllable. Whittaker leaned against the nearest seat, understanding that Elias's demands were not those of a passenger. They were a reform mandate that could make Atlantic Skies a pioneer in the industry or destroy it if rejected. Mr. Turner Whittaker said, strained these changes would cost millions. They would require restructuring, retraining, a complete overhaul, Amelia cut in. And if you do not, you will lose far more. Whittaker went silent. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Then he nodded. Not the nod of a man cornered, not the nod of a man forced. It was the nod of someone who knew there was no other path. We accept. The cabin exhaled, not loudly, but like hundreds of breaths released at once, in relief in victory. Terence slapped the side of his seat. Kara covered her face to hide her tears. Lena whispered, "This is history." A passenger shouted, "Damn right they accept." And Richard Alden could only stare at Whittaker in horror. He now understood no one owed him anything, but the entire system had just bowed to Elias Turner, and Elias was not done. He looked directly at Richard. No anger, no spite, just truth. "Mr. Alden, earlier you asked who I am." Richard stiffened, lips trembling. Elias answered, "I am a senior partner at Hamilton and Price. Our firm represents multiple board members of this airline." A chorus of stunned gasps rippled through the cabin. Elias continued, "And tomorrow I am flying to New York to defend a company you attempted to acquire through illegal tactics." Richard's jaw fell open. His assistant nearly dropped her tablet. Terence whispered softly, "Plot twist." Lena zoomed the camera in on Elias. "Guys, are you hearing this?" Elias lowered his voice, but each word stung like a needle. "You did not just pick the wrong man to bully. You picked the wrong day." The cabin froze. Richard felt every stare press down on him. But what terrified him most was not their eyes. It was the reflection of his own eyes in the cabin window, a man of power losing power in front of the person he had dismissed. Elias sat back in Seat 3, Alpha. Amelia stood beside him like a warrior at her comrade's side. Whittaker looked at them with a complex mixture of fear, respect, and the realization that tomorrow the entire aviation industry might change because of what happened today. On the live stream, hundreds of thousands watched. The #Turner Initiative began to rise. Elias exhaled softly, not out of exhaustion, not out of relief, but because he knew the next battle was only beginning. The silence after CEO Thomas Whitaker said, "We accept," lasted exactly 4 seconds. Yet those 4 seconds felt like a vacuum where every emotion was pulled away, leaving only one thing behind: the realization that this moment had just rewritten history. Then sound crashed over the cabin like a breaking wave. Not chaotic noise, but sharp breaths, stunned whispers, the soft thrum of seats trembling under shifting bodies, overwhelmed by emotion. Eyes met across the cabin. Kara Jensen covered her mouth as tears streamed uncontrollably. Terence Hall clenched his hand into a fist, not from anger, but from pride. A young passenger whispered, "I can't believe this is happening in front of us." Lena Brooks brought her camera even closer, her hands trembling, not out of fear, but out of exhilaration. She was live streaming a moment the world would be talking about for years. And Elias sat completely still, like a stone at the center of the storm he had created. Not triumphant, not boasting, just deeply steady, as though he could hear the heartbeat of a system shifting right in front of him. Whitaker had not even taken a full breath when the PR employee's iPad vibrated violently. She paled and handed the device to her CEO. One single large line blazed across the screen in red, breaking multiple United States senators call for investigation of Atlantic Skies incident. Whitaker closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had changed. He no longer looked like a CEO putting out a fire, but like a man who had just realized he was standing on top of a volcano. Behind him, Bradley Moore dragged a hand through his hair, desperate to maintain some grip on control. Sir Bradley whispered, "This is getting out of control." Whitaker turned to him, his voice colder than ice. "Out of control. It got out of control the moment you decided seat assignments were negotiable based on power." Bradley froze. For the first time in his career, he felt something only low-level employees normally felt: the looming weight of accountability. Richard Alden, silent for several minutes, suddenly sprang up like a compressed spring snapping loose. "This is absurd. I am your biggest corporate client. Do you have any idea who you're humiliating?" The air froze again. A few passengers flinched, but before Whitaker could respond, another voice rang from the aircraft door. "The only person humiliating you is yourself." Every head turned. A man in a grey suit walked in, wearing a badge that read, "Legal Affairs, Atlantic Skies." It was Jonathan Weber, the airline's chief legal counsel, the man a CEO calls when all other control has been lost. Richard's face drained of color. "Jonathan, good you're here." "Tell them Weber raised a hand." "Don't. Not in this situation." He stepped into the cabin, his eyes immediately finding Elias. His gaze held no pressure, no excuses, only respect. Then he turned to Whitaker. "Thomas, we need a strategy room immediately." But first, Weber glanced at the cabin, his voice firm enough to echo. "Mr. Turner is to be treated as the most important customer on this flight." Bradley nearly dropped his iPad. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Kara lit up from within, as if something lost had been restored. Elias simply tipped his head, the calm of a man who had predicted this moment well in advance. Amelia stood beside Elias with her arms crossed, her presence as sharp as a thin blade. "Mr. Weber," she said, "before anyone runs to any strategy room, we need clarity." "Full clarity." Weber nodded. "Of course." "Good," she replied. "Then let's begin with the basics." She tilted her head slightly, staring directly into him. "Who ordered my husband to be removed from his seat?" The question sucked the air out of the cabin. Bradley exhaled shakily. He had known this moment would come. Sweat glistened on his forehead. His throat tightened. Bradley began. But Patricia, who had been standing quietly near the back, suddenly stepped forward, positioning herself between Amelia and Bradley. "Mrs. Turner," she said, "the responsibility is mine." Bradley flinched. "Patricia, what are you doing?" She did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on Amelia, then on Elias. Bradley made the initial request. But I didn't stop it. I allowed the easiest solution instead of the right one. And I take responsibility. The silence that followed was not condemnation. It was respect. Elias nodded slightly. The only person unable to handle the moment was Richard. "Oh, please," he snapped. "Why are you all acting like saints? This is a seat." A seat, a corporate seat that I always, Terence Hall, stood up so suddenly that the cabin seemed to tremble. He stared at Richard, as though looking at a man who had never once understood the world beyond his own reflection. It was never just a seat. It was the message behind it. Elias glanced at Terence, warmth blooming in his chest for the first time in minutes. Terence continued. "People like you walk through airports with the confidence of kings. People like me walk through expecting to be questioned. This wasn't about travel, it was about dignity." The word struck the cabin like a chord. Many people nodded. An older white passenger placed a hand over his chest, as if realizing a truth he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Elias held Terence's gaze with silent gratitude. Weber turned to Elias and Amelia. "Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner," he said, "whatever happens next, we want to proceed correctly. If you are willing, the board would like to arrange a formal meeting upon landing." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Upon landing? This flight hasn't even taken off." Weber gave a tight, uneasy smile. "Oh, we're not taking off today." Kara blinked. "What do you mean?" Weber pointed at the iPad screen. "Look at this." Lena immediately turned her camera toward it. The news ticker blazed. "FAA requests temporary hold on Atlantic skies. Flight 217. Pending investigation." The cabin erupted with noise. Kara staggered slightly. Patricia pressed a hand to her temple. Bradley nearly collapsed into a seat. Richard slammed his fist into the overhead bin. "This is insane." Weber looked at him as if studying a relic from an outdated era. "No, Mr. Alden. What's insane is believing your privilege is above the law." Richard went silent. Completely. Elias exhaled softly. The situation was escalating faster than he anticipated. Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Elias met her eyes. The message was clear. He was all right. Not because things were easy, but because he was no longer fighting alone. On Lena's live stream, more than 300,000 viewers watched simultaneously. Comments poured like a flood. Elias for president. This is what accountability looks like. That wife, though powerhouse. Richard is finished. This is history happening live. Lena brought the camera closer to Elias. The light illuminated his face, steady as stone, yet behind the calm there was a flicker of pain. The truth that this should never have happened. Not to him. Not to anyone. He looked directly into the camera. "People deserve equal treatment," Elias said. "On the ground, in the air, everywhere." Hearts and cheering comments flooded the live stream. At that moment, Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit. His face no longer carried the confidence he had earlier. For the first time during the entire incident, his eyes held something no one expected from him: regret. He walked toward Elias, stopped and bowed his head slightly. "Mr. Turner," he said softly. I owe you an apology. Elias watched him silently. The captain continued. When Mr. Alden demanded the seat, I assumed you would be the easier one to move. I made a decision based on convenience, not fairness. Kara turned away quietly, wiping her tears. Terence muttered, Damn the captain, too. Captain Reynolds took a deep breath. I was wrong, and I am willing to accept whatever consequences the airline decides. No one expected that. No one thought the captain would admit his fault. But he did. Weber nodded once, acknowledging the gravity of it. Elias simply replied, Thank you for your honesty. One sentence. Enough for the captain to feel something loosen in his chest. Weber looked at Whittaker. Thomas, we need to secure this situation before the Department of Justice statement comes out. Amelia's eyes sharpened. The DOJ. The Department of Justice. Weber nodded heavily. Someone from the live stream sent footage directly to the Civil Rights Division. They are monitoring as we speak. The cabin fell silent again. Elias felt the shift in the air. This was no longer an airline issue, no longer a CEO issue, no longer an internal issue. This was becoming a national matter. Terence stepped closer to Elias and Amelia. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, just know we're all behind you. Elias nodded in gratitude. Amelia looked around the cabin at the faces of different races, ages, and backgrounds. This was no longer anyone's singular fight. She turned to Elias, her voice low, only for him. They believe in you, and they need you. Elias looked down, then back at her. I won't back down, he said. Amelia smiled gently. I know. Weber moved to the front, addressing the cabin loudly. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be arranging a secure escort to move Mr. Turner and his wife to a formal mediation room. All passengers will be interviewed as witnesses. You will not be asked to disembark until we have clearance. A young passenger raised a hand. So we're all part of the investigation. Weber nodded. Yes. And your statements may shape federal policy. Shock rippled through the cabin. Terence chuckled. Well, guess I'll tell my students I was part of history today. Kara turned to Elias. Mr. Turner, thank you. For all of us. Elias shook his head. Don't thank me yet. Kara blinked. Why not? Elias looked toward the slightly open aircraft door, where a beam of white corridor light poured in like an invitation to a larger battle. Because this fight is about to get bigger. And he knew, out there beyond the door, waited not just a meeting, not just an apology, not just reform, but a confrontation between a man who had been underestimated his entire life and an entire industry built on the assumption that people like him would stay silent. Elias rose from his seat. Amelia rose beside him. Weber and Whittaker stood waiting. Kara watched them leave as if she were witnessing the beginning of a new generation of leaders. And as Elias stepped toward the door, the cabin erupted in a sound no one expected. Applause. Not applause for victory. Applause for courage. Elias paused for one breath, drawing strength from the moment. Then he stepped out of the aircraft, straight into the center of the storm, ready to strike at its very core. The hallway leading out of the aircraft felt longer than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because of the weight of hundreds of eyes following Elias, as if he were the only person in that space still carrying the original color of justice. The applause behind him slowly faded, blending with the hum of the air conditioning, the soft roll of suitcase wheels on carpet, and the synchronized footsteps of the security team walking close beside Elias and Amelia. Amelia walked next to her husband, her posture straight every step, declaring, "I am not here to watch. I am here to change things." Weber led the way. Whittaker followed just behind him, his face pale under the pressure. Patricia came next, worry glimmering in her eyes, but steadiness anchoring her steps. Passengers and airport staff quickly gathered along both sides of the corridor. Some raised their phones to film. Some simply stood still, watching Elias the way people watch someone doing something they themselves had never found the courage to do. As they reached the second corner, a security officer leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Mr. Turner, are you comfortable?" "Do you need anything?" Elias answered softly. "Just clarity. Not water. Not a VIP room. Not a promise. Clarity. Because if the truth was not captured from the very beginning, it would be twisted by every hand it passed through." When the group reached the area behind the jet bridge, Weber stopped before a frosted glass door. He opened it, revealing a large, empty meeting room where white lights cast a cold glow across a long conference table. Black leather chairs lined both sides. A large screen on the wall displayed a map of the airport and news headlines scrolling rapidly. In the center of that room, Elias stepped in, as if entering a battlefield he had always known he would face. Amelia followed him, her gaze sweeping across the space, assessing whether it was safe enough to protect the truth her husband was about to unleash. Weber moved toward the head of the table. "Please have a seat." But Elias did not sit. He rested both hands on the back of a chair, waiting as the necessary personnel gathered. Outside the door, 2 security officers kept the growing crowd at bay as rumors exploded through the airport like detonating charges. When everyone had arrived, Whittaker Weber, Patricia Bradley, Captain Reynolds, Elias looked at them like characters in a painting placed exactly where fate intended them to be. Amelia began. "Before we start, we set one rule: no evasion, no softening responsibility, no reframing to save face. We want the truth, not the digestible version of it." Patricia nodded. Weber sighed but accepted. Bradley stared down at the table. Captain Reynolds remained silent, but his eyes stayed fixed on Elias, as if waiting for the chance to speak honestly. Whittaker leaned back, gripping the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew this was not a strategy meeting. This was the first hearing, and he was sitting on the defendant's side of the court. Elias spoke slowly. "Let's begin." The room's collective heartbeat seemed to hesitate. Elias turned his eyes to Bradley first. "Mr. Moore," he said, his voice smooth but cutting, "I want to hear it from you." "Who first mentioned that I should be removed from my seat?" Bradley inhaled deeply. His life had been built on giving orders, instructing others, making demands. But he had never been forced to answer a question under the weight of every relevant witness. He swallowed. "It was me." Elias tilted his head slightly. Why Bradley glanced toward Captain Reynolds, then toward the empty spot where Richard Alden would be standing, if he were here, his shadow still looming in the room. Because Mr. Alden demanded, Seat 3 Alpha. And he always had it. Always, Elias asked. Someone who pays like everyone else, yet always has a fixed seat. Bradley clenched his fists. He's a diamond corporate member. Top tier. He expects things. Elias looked into his eyes. And you feared losing your job if you refused him. Bradley closed his eyes. Yes. A simple confession. But it landed like a ton of stone on the conference room floor. Amelia tapped her fingers lightly on the table. That is not an excuse. It is the result of a system built on privilege and fear. Patricia stepped forward, her voice trembling. I am responsible as well. When Bradley told me I did not examine the situation properly, I prioritized a VIP over the dignity of another passenger. Elias breathed slowly. He did not need them to fall to their knees. He needed them to recognize their own faults. Then he turned to Captain Reynolds. The room tightened another degree. Captain Elias said quietly, "I want to hear from you." The captain placed both hands on the table, fingers interlocked. When Mr. Alden made the request, he began his voice, low and coarse, like stone being sharpened. I knew it was unreasonable. But I also knew he was a major client. I thought if I handled it quickly, the issue would disappear. Elias listened carefully. "I was wrong," the captain said, offering no excuse. Elias asked, "Why did you call security?" The captain stared down at his hands. "Because I assumed you would react strongly, that you might create a disturbance. Someone pushed into such a situation often loses their composure." Elias paused. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with pain. He asked softly, "Was it because of my skin color?" The room froze. Bradley stared at the table. Patricia blinked back tears. Weber slowly removed his glasses. Captain Reynolds drew a long breath, then responded, low but clear. "Yes." One word. But it weighed as heavily as Elias's entire life. Amelia placed a hand on her husband's shoulder, light as breath, steady as an anchor. Elias did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the captain. After a long stillness, he said, "Thank you for the truth." The room tightened again. No one expected this response. No anger, no revenge, no weaponizing the moment. He had chosen truth and forgiveness in a way no one in the room could instantly understand. Whittaker leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner, Atlantic Skies made a grave mistake. Compared to the crises I've handled before, this is not just a PR issue. This is a moral collapse." Amelia nodded once. "Correct," Whittaker continued, "and I need to know honestly, are your demands final, or will there be more?" Elias studied him, as if pulling the answer from the deepest part of himself. Finally, he said, "I do not want to be anyone's enemy, but I will not allow this system to keep stepping on people who have no voice." He placed one hand flat on the table. "I want to be part of the reform process." Every head lifted. Not as a lawyer, not as a victim, as an advisor. Elias continued, "To ensure what happened today never happens again." Weber turned to Whittaker. "Thomas, if we refuse—" No, Whittaker cut him off. "We do not refuse." He stood. "Mr. Turner, we invite you to become special advisor on civil equity for Atlantic Skies Airlines." Kara gasped. Terence, listening through live stream, nearly shouted, "Yes, sir." Lena whispered, "This is insane, but in the best possible way." Amelia rested her hand on Elias's back, full of pride. Elias didn't smile. He did not bask in victory. He simply answered, "I will accept if everything I propose is implemented transparently and publicly." Whittaker nodded firmly. "It will be. I promise." A contract unspoken, but heavier than any signed legal document in the aviation industry, was formed in that moment. But the most unexpected turning point came from the person no one expected to speak. Bradley Moore rose, voice cracking. "Mr. Turner, I want to apologize, not because I'm being forced to, but because I am truly ashamed." Elias looked at him without mockery, without coldness. "Mr. Moore," he said, "what matters is not the mistake, but how we correct it." Bradley lowered his head. Elias had forgiven him in a way he did not deserve. And that was exactly what compelled him to change. In the corner, the TV screen flashed with breaking news. Breaking petition, demanding airline reform. Gains 1.2 million signatures in 30 minutes. Patricia pressed her hand over her mouth. Webber whispered, "Unprecedented." Whitaker sank into his chair, his hands trembling, as he realized the airline's future now rested entirely on the shoulders of the man standing before him. Elias read the headline as if reading the next chapter of a book he had been forced to write. Amelia looked at him, her voice soft. "Do you see? You're not just defending yourself. You're changing this entire country." Elias raised his eyes towards the ceiling, as if hearing the echoes of every nameless person who had been mistreated on a plane, forced out of their seat, silenced to avoid being labeled a problem. Then he spoke a quiet sentence that shook every heart in the room, "And I will not stop." Inside the airport's emergency conference room, the air felt dense, like the thick mist that gathers before a violent storm. Everyone assumed that once Elias accepted the role of special advisor, the tension would ease. They were wrong. What would happen next would turn this from an airline scandal into a national earthquake. As the internal meeting paused, so subgroups could prepare their next steps, Elias and Amelia stepped back toward the wide glass window overlooking the runway. Rows of aircraft stood motionless like giant beasts waiting for orders. Elias laid a fingertip against the cool glass and murmured, "Do you feel it?" Amelia tilted her head. Feel what Elias watched the golden sunset glint across the wings, a system trembling right beneath us. Amelia said nothing. She simply squeezed his hand, gentle but firm. The door opened. Weber stepped in, his expression more strained than it had been minutes earlier. "What happened?" Elias asked. Weber handed him the iPad. The screen was flooded with emails, alerts, and leaked internal communications. The board had ordered CEO Whitaker into an emergency session within 30 minutes. Major shareholders were demanding explanations. The Department of Transportation required a full report by end of day. A prominent law firm had announced they were preparing a class action on behalf of the passengers. But the last email was the one that made Elias's brow tighten. From the President's Civil Rights Advisory Council. Subject Mr. Turner, request for immediate contact. Amelia covered her mouth. "They want to invite you to speak with the White House." Weber nodded. "Not officially yet. But they are watching closely." The room fell silent. Everyone understood. This was no longer an airline issue. Outside, the terminal hallway was packed. Security had to form barricades. Lena Brooks stood in the center of the crowd, her camera trembling slightly. "Live stream at nearly 3 million viewers," she whispered. "My God." She checked her screen as the comments poured in like a waterfall. "Elias is our modern civil rights leader. This airline is finished if they don't fix this. We're watching history." There are rare moments when people know instantly that they are witnessing something future generations will study. Lena realized this was one of those moments. Weber returned to the table, his voice rough with pressure. "Mr. Turner, we need to discuss activating the Interagency Investigative Team. DOJ wants footage audio statements. They want you as the primary witness." Elias did not flinch. "I will cooperate." Then he added, soft but sharp as a blade, "But I will not let them turn this into a witch hunt. I want truth, not theater." Weber understood immediately. Elias did not want Captain Reynolds, Patricia, or Bradley sacrificed as scapegoats. He wanted reform, not revenge. That earned Weber's respect even more. The door swung open again. Someone walked in whom no one expected to arrive so quickly. Harriet Warren, chairwoman of the Board of Atlantic Skies. A woman in her 70s, silver hair, tied-back eyes, sharp enough to cut through any pretense. The entire room stood instinctively. Harriet did not greet anyone. She did not smile. She did not attempt to ease the atmosphere. She looked straight at Elias. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice low and smooth, but filled with authority. "I want to hear the story from you." Elias met her gaze without wavering. "Do you want the polished version?" he asked. "Or the true one?" Harriet lifted a corner of her lips. "Not a smile, but a measurement." "All my life, I have only worked with the truth." Elias began recounting everything from the moment of boarding, to Richard Alden's outburst, to the captain calling security, to the moment the situation exploded into a crisis. Harriet did not interrupt. She did not blink. She did not take notes. She listened with the full attention of someone who had watched entire systems burn from the inside. After nearly 10 minutes, she finally spoke. "Thank you. This is the first time in many years someone has spoken to me without fearing me." Elias answered calmly, "I speak truth, not permission." Harriet let out a soft, low laugh. "Good. We need someone like you." Weber looked at her startled. "Madam Chairwoman? You mean?" Harriet clasped her hands behind her back and stepped closer to Elias. "You will not simply advise. If you want, you will take part in writing the Civil Air Equity Act, a new framework for the entire aviation industry." Amelia's eyes widened. "An act for the whole industry." Harriet nodded. "I will submit it to the coalition, and if DOJ agrees, it will be considered a national standard." Bradley's jaw dropped. Patricia covered her mouth as tears formed. Captain Reynolds bowed his head deeply. Elias remained still, but something shifted in his eyes. The anger was gone. The exhaustion was gone. What remained was the clarity of a man who suddenly saw the road he was meant to walk, long difficult, but unmistakably his. "I will do it," Elias said. Harriet extended her hand. Elias took it. The handshake was simple, brief, unadorned, but it cracked through the room like lightning, tearing open a night sky. They had not yet taken their seats when a sharp alarm rang from the internal security system. Whittaker jerked upright. "What now?" A security officer rushed in, pale. "So the media just released new information." Everyone turned toward the large screen. Breaking news alerts flashed one after another. Whistleblower leak Richard Alden, accused of similar incidents in the past. 6 passengers claim they were pressured to move for Alden on previous flights. Former flight attendant, "We were told to prioritize him, regardless of fairness." Patricia covered her mouth with both hands. Bradley stepped back. Captain Reynolds turned white. Harriet stood still, her breathing slowing. Amelia whispered to Elias, "See, this wasn't an incident. It's a pattern." Elias nodded. "And patterns must be broken." Whittaker's phone vibrated over and over. He glanced down, and his face collapsed, as if he had just seen his own verdict. "Harriet board meeting?" she asked. Whittaker nodded. "They are demanding my resignation." Patricia's voice trembled. "But you didn't cause this. You only handled Harriet, cut in firmly. A system reflects its leadership. If the system fails, leadership must bear the weight." Whittaker looked at Elias, an expression mixing regret with relief. "Elias!" "I am sorry I didn't see the problem sooner." Elias met his gaze, neither cruel nor forgiving, simply honest. Better late than never. Whittaker lowered his head. He knew he had failed, but Elias didn't need him to fall. He needed him to be truthful, and Whittaker had done that. Harriet inhaled sharply and addressed the room. Effective immediately, anyone who enabled Richard Alden will be investigated. Bradley froze. Patricia whispered, "Oh, dear God." Harriet continued, "But anyone who speaks the truth, anyone who supports reform, will be protected." Bradley looked at Elias and silently exhaled in relief. Patricia clasped her hands and bowed her head gratefully. Captain Reynolds straightened his posture, steady for the first time in an hour. Harriet stepped close to Elias. "Now I need to hear one more thing from you." "I am ready," he said. "Where do you want to begin?" Elias looked around the room. At Amelia, at Weber, at Captain Reynolds, at Patricia, at Whittaker, the leader who had failed, but stayed to face the consequences. Then he said slowly, each word hitting the core of the issue. "I want to begin with culture. A system can change rules, but only people can change themselves." Harriet nodded once, strong and decisive. "Then you will have everything you need." But just as everyone felt they had survived the hardest part, the conference room door slammed open so hard it hit the wall. A staff member raced in, breathless. "Harriet Weber. Everyone, you need to see this." He held up his phone. Lena Brooks was live-streaming from the main concourse. The lighting flickered. The camera shook. But everyone saw it clearly. A group of people wearing black suits badges, reading Montgomery Holdings, were marching into the airport. Leading them were 2 senior attorneys, and walking between them was Richard Alden. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression twisted with fury. He stared directly into the camera and growled each word. "This is a war," Amelia whispered. "He's preparing a counterattack." Weber's face drained of color. He brought his corporate legal team. "They will countersue. They will launch a smear campaign. They will try to paint Elias as the aggressor." Harriet gripped the back of a chair. "We cannot let him fight this on his terms." Elias stared at the screen. He was not afraid, not intimidated, not shaken. He spoke softly, yet every person in the room heard him clearly. "If he wants a war, then we will show him what it means to fight with truth." Harriet took a deep breath. "Mr. Turner, prepare yourself. What comes next will not be another meeting." She looked around the room, her eyes burning with the fire of a seasoned warrior. "It will be a trial held in the court of a nation." Elias squeezed Amelia's hand gently. He inhaled, slow, steady. Then he said, "I am ready." The conference room doors burst open as if a cold wind had torn straight through an atmosphere stretched tight as a violin string. An airport staff member ran in, breath-broken, holding up a phone so everyone could see. On the screen, Richard Alden was striding into the main concourse of O'Hare Airport, followed by a formation of men in black suits, dark glasses, faces carved from the mold of corporate power. He stared directly into Lena Brooks's live-stream camera. His eyes showed no fear, no remorse, only the fire of a man carrying arrogance and venom in his very bones. "This is a war." He snarled each word, lips curling in provocation. The statement dropped like a sledgehammer, making both the conference room and the airport concourse erupt in whispers, shock and disbelief. Weber practically snatched the phone. "My God, he has lost his mind." Harriet Warren's brow tightened, her entire presence turning to stone. Amelia stepped half a pace back, but not from fear. She looked at Elias, waiting to see how the man she trusted more than anyone would respond. Elias did not move. He stood still at the eye of the storm, like a lamp that refuses to go out even with hurricane winds tearing at the world outside. In the concourse, Montgomery Holdings' legal battalion advanced, spreading out like a trained army. The lead attorney, Gregory Shaw, infamous for lawsuits that crushed opponents under astronomical legal costs, stepped onto a makeshift podium his team had assembled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory declared, voice forged from cold steel, "Mr. Alden is the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. We will pursue every legal avenue necessary to restore his name." The crowd roared in chaos. Some booed, some recorded. Others, exhausted by injustice in society, could not believe the instigator now dared claim victimhood. They had not seen anything yet. Gregory lifted a thick file. "We are requesting the Federal Aviation Administration to investigate disruptive behavior aboard the aircraft by one passenger, Elias Turner." The moment Elias's name was spoken, the crowd exploded. A lawyer. Is this a joke? He did nothing wrong. Gregory did not care. Richard stood behind him, smiling with cruel delight. He believed he still held real power. He believed wealth influence and a platoon of lawyers would save him. He believed he could crush Elias like paper. He was mistaken. In the conference room, Weber slammed a hand onto the table. He is flipping the story. He wants to make the victim look like the offender. Harriet gripped the chair. And he believes he can, because he has always gotten away with it. Elias clasped his hands behind his back and walked toward the large screen displaying the live stream. Amelia watched him, calm but blazing with protective fire. Elias stared at Richard's face. The man was smiling. Not the smile of a victor. The smile of someone who did not understand he had already lost. Elias spoke softly, like wind. "All right. If he wants war, then we will show him that this is not a battlefield he knows." Harriet turned to him. "You have a plan?" Elias nodded. "His war depends on noise." He looked into Harriet's eyes. "Ours depends on truth." Weber exhaled. "We need to counter immediately." Harriet crossed her arms, eyes sharp as ice. "No, not immediately." Weber froze. "Not immediately. Do you understand what he just did?" Harriet tapped her finger on the table, each tap sounding like a nail sealing a coffin. "We counter only when he no longer controls the narrative." Elias smiled the first smile in hours. "Exactly." In the concourse, Gregory Shaw kept pouring gasoline onto the fire. Passenger Turner incited the crowd. He refused reasonable instructions from the flight crew. And he, Gregory, never finished. The entire concourse shook, not from shouting, but from the arrival of another group, marching from the opposite direction, moving toward Alden's podium like a dark wave. They were 12 attorneys from Wilson and Hayes, 5 civil rights specialists from the American Civil Liberties Union, 3 representatives of the National Bar Association, and leading them a woman with soft curls, a fitted black suit, and eyes sharp as molten metal. Janelle Carter, senior partner at Wilson and Hayes, famed for landmark civil rights cases. She stepped onto Gregory's podium without invitation, without permission. Gregory scowled. "This is a private statement." Janelle lifted one finger to her lips. "Shh!" The crowd erupted with laughter. Gregory flushed red. Richard stared in disbelief. Janelle turned to the live-stream camera. Her voice rang like a bronze bell. "He claims he is the victim." "Then allow me to explain what truth actually looks like." The crowd erupted in cheers. Gregory stepped back. Richard faltered, as if the ground beneath him had dropped an inch. Janelle lifted her file. "We have video evidence from 6 passengers proving that Mr. Alden was the one causing the disturbance. We have audio recordings of racially charged insults. We have evidence that Mr. Alden pressured crew members to remove passengers from their seats on multiple previous flights. The crowd exploded. Gregory attempted to respond. "This is outrageous." Janelle looked at him as if he were scrap paper. "You want to sue our client?" She tilted her head. "Go ahead. We look forward to every minute of it." She finished with a sentence that detonated through the entire airport. "We are not representing a victim. We are representing history being rewritten." In the conference room, Harriet Warren let out a short laugh. "I like her." Weber exhaled. Janelle Carter always knows how to enter a battlefield. Amelia looked at Elias. "You were right. He no longer controls the story." Elias placed his hand on the table, tapping slowly. The tap carried the weight of a strategist preparing his next move. "It is time to release the data set." Weber jerked his head up. "What data set?" Elias looked straight at him. "The data set I have collected over years of working with multiple airlines." Weber froze. "You have data?" Harriet tightened her grip on the chair. "You mean," Elias nodded, "all the discrimination cases that were ignored, all the internal reports buried in storage, all the so-called random screenings that were never random." The room fell silent. Not fearful silence. The silence of truth finally being uncovered. Harriet whispered, "With that amount of data, you could redefine the law." Elias met her gaze. "Yes, and I will." At the same moment in the concourse, Janelle Carter projected the files onto a massive screen. Charts of discrimination rates across the years, internal emails, overlooked incident logs, staff reports about pressure from VIP clients, statistics showing passengers removed by racial demographics. The crowd fell into absolute silence, a silence more powerful than any shout because it was the sound of realization. Gregory swallowed hard. Richard stood frozen like a statue. Then Janelle delivered the final blow. "And this is only 1/10 of the data we are permitted to release today." The concourse erupted. Shouts, applause, chanting, "Accountability, accountability, accountability." Richard stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. For the first time, he realized this war was no longer Richard versus Elias. It was Richard versus truth. And truth does not lose. In the conference room, Harriet leaned forward. "Elias Turner, you are not just changing an airline." Amelia looked at her husband, eyes shining. Harriet continued, voice deep and resonant, like a national declaration. "You are laying the groundwork for a new law in the United States." Weber placed his hand on the table. "Mr. Turner, do you understand what you are doing?" Elias looked at everyone in the room. "Yes." Then he said, "Soft but as solid as steel striking the ground. I am rebuilding justice in a place where it has been broken for decades." Amelia touched his back gently, pride glowing from her eyes. Harriet rose. "Prepare for a national press conference." Weber nodded, and Alden Harriet gazed toward the glass wall, where flashing media lights reflected in her eyes. Alden will fall because of the truth. We do not need to lay a hand on him. Elias smiled gently. That is the most beautiful form of justice. Before they could leave, a staff member rushed in. "Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner, something extremely important." Amelia stepped forward. "What is it?" The staff member held out his phone, hands trembling. "The media is reporting the federal court has officially opened a nationwide civil rights investigation into all airlines based on today's events." The room froze. Elias inhaled slowly. Not in fear. In acknowledgement of the magnitude settling onto his shoulders. Harriet tilted her head. "Are you ready to become an icon?" Elias replied. "I do not want to be an icon." He looked at Amelia. The only steady ground he needed. I just want to do what is right. Amelia squeezed his hand. That is exactly why they chose you. Elias closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, there was a light of a man who sees the long road ahead. Dangerous. Fiery. But right. Then he said, "Let's begin." Harriet nodded firmly. Weber raised his phone. Amelia stood beside her husband, and together they stepped out of the conference room, straight into the greatest battle the aviation industry had ever witnessed. The doors of the conference room opened, and the world outside no longer resembled what it had been a few hours earlier. The hallway leading out into the airport was now packed shoulder to shoulder, with reporters' cameras lined up like battalions, microphones jutting forward like spear tips aimed at the doorway. Flashes burst non-stop so bright it felt as if the airport had transformed into an accidental Broadway stage. Elias Turner stepped out no longer as an anonymous passenger, but as the living reflection of a revolution that had just been lit. Amelia walked beside him, steady and unwavering, her eyes unmoved, even as hundreds of lenses pointed directly at them. Harriet Warren Weber, Patricia and Captain Reynolds followed close behind, each wearing a different expression: determination, concern, remorse, hope. And through the roaring sea of sound, one voice rose above the rest. Mr. Turner, do you plan to sue the airline? Will you take Richard Alden to federal court? Is it true you will draft a new civil aviation law? Are you now the national face of anti-discrimination? Elias stood still for one heartbeat. The noise of the crowd collapsed, as if someone had pressed a mute button. Not because they were silent, but because Elias was choosing his words. And when he spoke, they wanted to hear every syllable. "This is not about me," Elias said. One sentence, but enough to make every camera zoom in closer and every microphone lift higher. This is about every passenger who has ever been treated unfairly. About those who never had a voice. About the stories forgotten in the skies of America. His gaze swept across the crowd, touching each group: a father holding a small child, an elderly woman leaning on her cane, a student clutching his backpack, a multiracial family standing close together, people who had been so-called randomly screened 10 times, yet never dared to speak. "I am not here for revenge," Elias said slowly. "I am here for change." The crowd erupted in applause, but Elias raised a hand. "It is not time to celebrate. There is much work to be done." Amelia glanced at him with a blend of pride and worry. Elias might not fear anything, but she knew the road in front of him would not be smooth. Suddenly, a group pushed forward. Lena Brooks led them live stream, still running to millions. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The people watching want to ask you this." She held up her phone. The screen flooded with comments. Ask him what justice means to him. Will he fight for us too? Is he doing this for fame or for change? Tell him we stand with him. Elias looked into the camera as if staring into the eyes of millions. Justice, he said, is not about who gets punished. Justice is about making sure the wrong cannot happen again. His voice deepened as he added, "And yes, I will fight for every one of you." The crowd erupted again. Weber murmured beside him. He was born for this without even knowing. Harriet answered softly. He was not born for it. He was forged. And she was right. Every moment Elias endured in silence. Every time he was doubted. Because of his skin, every condescending look in every boardroom, all of it sharpened him to stand here. But the press conference was not over. A sudden movement on the east side of the concourse pulled every eye toward it. A protective circle opened like parting water. And at its center, an older woman appeared, silver hair, dishevelled eyes, heavy with exhaustion. Richard Alden's mother. No one expected this. Richard clearly did not either. He stood far back, eyes wide, lips forming silent words. "Mom, no, Mom, go home." But she kept walking. She stopped in front of Elias. No camera dared blink. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice shaking so much the words nearly fell apart. I want to apologize for my son." The crowd gasped. Richard froze as if struck. Amelia covered her mouth. Patricia whispered, "Dear God." Elias looked at her, his expression softening. He did not lower himself to win. He did not raise himself to prove anything. He simply said, "You do not need to apologize for anyone else." Tears spilled down her cheeks. He is my son. I know he is wrong, but he is not a monster. He has just never had anyone stop him. Her words pierced the room like an arrow. Elias inhaled deeply. "Change," he said, "always begins the moment someone says, 'Enough.' Today we said it." She nodded, then was gently guided away. Richard remained frozen for a long moment before walking off, not as a chief executive officer, but as a fractured man, unsure what part of himself was left to hold on to. But the climax was not over. The press staff handed a microphone to Harriet Warren. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harriet began, "the board of directors of Atlantic Skies has unanimously voted, and this is the official announcement." The entire hall leaned forward. Harriet declared, "Richard Alden is permanently banned from flying on all Atlantic Skies aircraft." The crowd erupted in shock and cheers. A reporter nearly dropped her microphone. Gregory Shaw stood frozen. Richard screamed, "You cannot do this to me." Harriet looked at him. "We already have." Then she turned to Elias. "And we officially announce that Elias Turner will join us in building the new framework called the Turner Aviation Equity Standards." Shouts rose like waves striking stone. Amelia squeezed Elias's hand. He looked at her, and for the first time that day, allowed himself a true smile. But an even greater moment awaited. Harriet stepped close and said quietly, "Mr. Turner, the president, wants to speak with you." "Tonight." Amelia pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh God," Weber went rigid. Elias asked calmly. "Where by video call from the Situation Room?" Harriet replied. Elias nodded. "Then let us go." They left the airport through a secured route. On the way to the vehicle, Lena Brooks ran after them, breathless. Mr. Turner won last line for the live stream. Elias turned, looked into the camera with unwavering resolve, but no arrogance, and said, "Do not stay silent when you deserve to be heard. You do not need power to stand up, you only need truth." The live stream exploded. Comments flooded with encouragement, tears, outrage, and hope. Elias turned away. In the SUV taking them to the temporary Federal Investigation Office, Amelia rested her head on his shoulder. "Are you tired?" she whispered. Elias looked out the window at the city lights streaking like long trails of stars. "Tired," he said, "but never tired of doing what is right." Amelia smiled and laced her fingers with his. "Do you know what makes me proudest? What you did not win with force. You won with character." Elias rested his head against her hair. "Then we will keep building. Together," she whispered. The SUV rolled into the Chicago night, carrying the man who had gone from an anonymous passenger to a symbol of change. Later that night, after the meeting with the president, Elias stood alone by a window, watching the city lights flicker like untold stories. Weber approached. "You know, Weber said what you did today will reshape the law for the next 3 to 5 years. Elias did not look away from the window. I know. And you also know you are no longer a normal person. Elias closed his eyes for one moment. I just want the world my child grows up in to be fairer than the one I walked through. Weber placed a hand on his shoulder. And that is why you will succeed. Elias turned and nodded. Then he left the room, the light behind him, stretching his shadow across the floor, a straight and steady shadow, the shadow of a man who chose to stand and who will never step back. From the perspective of an expert in organizational power, human behavior, and the hidden mechanisms that shape modern service systems, the story of Elias Turner reminds us of a truth that never grows old. Injustice does not always announce itself through shouting or blatant actions. Often it hides behind the word procedure, behind dismissive glances, behind the leniency given to those with privilege, and the harsher standards imposed on those whom society believes do not belong here. But from this same story, we see something even more important. Real strength is not found in a loud voice or in a title printed on a badge, but in the calm knowledge and unwavering steadiness of a person who refuses to be pushed out of a place he fully deserves to sit in. Elias did not defend a seat. He defended a principle, a standard, a reminder that human dignity cannot be reassigned simply because someone believes they are more important than you. If today's journey made you think, if it made you feel that fairness does not appear naturally, but is built by those brave enough to stand firm, then please, like the video, so this story can reach further and touch more people. And do not forget to subscribe so you can follow more stories where the courage of one person can change an entire system. Before you leave the video, leave a short comment. The phrase, "stand firm," as a reminder that sometimes a single moment of not stepping back is enough to spark a powerful change.